Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, zerilli-marimò. There are still a few seats unclaimed. We have this habit here that when the event starts, if the person is not here, the seat can be taken, except that one that is mine. But Stella is going to keep an eye on it. I know. Thank you for being here. Such a great number of enthusiastic people. I think we didn't have this big a crowd when Richard Gere came to read from Calvino last year. And I believe this is due, of course, to these four formidable ladies that from tomorrow morning will be on view at the Morgan Library, but it's due, of course, to our speaker that we have the fortune of having here with us tonight. As we announced in the invitation that we sent out, it's very rare that these four ladies leave the church in which they normally reside, in the very small town of Carmignano, in the countryside of Florence. So it's a very, very special gift to the city that they're going to be here for a while with us. And I thought the best way to celebrate their arrival in Florence, in New York, from tomorrow, would be to have one of the curators of the exhibit at the Morgan Library to talk to us about this very, very special painting. And the occasion for us even more special because this co-curator is a professor of art history at NYU in Florence and also an affiliate in the Department of Italian Studies here at New York University. He's also the coordinator of graduate studies and special programs at NYU in Florence, Villa La Pietra, a place where I have the fortune to work every summer for the past 20-some months. And we have here Larry Wolf, that from January would be at the helm of NYU in Florence La Pietra, one of the most coveted positions, I believe, in the academic world. Congratulations, Larry, for your appointment. I know you will do great things, and I hope we can cooperate in many, many ways in these two sides of Italy and the United States, between Florence and New York. And Bruce Edelstein is an art historian, and his specialty is art collections in Medici and Florence and Renaissance art, especially of the 16th century. He has a lot to say about the Visitazione di Carmignano. He's a wonderful speaker, a great colleague, and a great professor, and it's a great pleasure for me tonight to introduce to you Bruce Edelstein. Please welcome him.
Thank you. I'm a little overwhelmed, especially after that introduction. Quite a lot to live up to. I thank Stefano for the invitation to speak this evening, and I'm delighted to be speaking here at the Casa Italiana, which I consider my New York home. As an academic, as Stefano said, I am affiliated faculty in the Department of Italian Studies, and I'm very delighted to be here. And thank you all for coming out. With no further ado, these remarkable four women are the stars of a stupendous painting that is much beloved. It is not an understudied work of art or a little known work of art. It is one of the greatest masterpieces of the 16th century Florentine painter, Jacopo da Pontormo. And several years ago, I was approached by the parish in Carmignano and asked if I would conceive an exhibition as part of a larger project that I'll present to you at the end of the talk this evening. And this was obviously an amazing opportunity, a dream come true. I had spent all of my life studying the art of precisely this period, but it was also a formidable challenge. What could one say about a work of art that is so well known, and a work of art that had such a significant, even recent bibliography? And the first idea that we had for this exhibition turned out to be a truly serendipitous choice. Our dream for the Visitation was to be able to reunite it with its only surviving drawing. It is not surprising that a work of art from the 16th century only has a single surviving drawing or no surviving drawings at all. Drawings, of course, are works on paper. Paper is very fragile and something that does not necessarily survive. It's a little unusual in the case of Pontormo because Pontormo was one of the most prolific draftsmen of the 16th century. He left us a huge corpus of drawings. Some almost 400 sheets have been identified with his hand. It is one of the largest corpuses of drawings of any Florentine painter of the 16th century. This drawing, it turns out, we were able to say many new things about this drawing, and at the Morgan Library, starting tomorrow morning when the exhibition opens to the public, you will have this remarkable opportunity to see this rare drawing together with this painting that has never traveled outside of Italy and probably will never travel outside of Italy again. The drawing, almost certainly, is the same drawing that was seen by a scholar who wrote a guidebook to Florence that was published in 1677. And this is the first reference to the existence of the painting, which, as we'll see, is a little strange. The painting is first recorded in 1677. It is recorded together with a work that is described as a Modelo. In the past, it has sometimes been doubted that this drawing was the Modelo seen by Giovanni Cinelli and described in his book of 1677. But scientific analyses performed in preparation for the conservation, the magnificent conservation of the Visitation, recently performed by the conservator Daniele Rossi, revealed something extraordinary about the techniques that Pontormo used to execute the Visitation. We'll see why this is so important as we move along, but suffice it to say that this discovery, only made in 2013 for the restoration work that was completed in 2014, allowed us to confirm without any doubt that this drawing is the Modelo, which has a specific meaning for art historians. It means that it is a finished drawing, and there are parts of this drawing that don't look very finished, which is partly why scholars might not have recognized it as such before. But it is very clearly the very final thought of Pontormo on paper before he continued to elaborate his composition on the painted panel. These discoveries, as we will see, also inform our understanding of portraits that Pontormo made during the same period. And this period is a particularly dramatic one in Florentine history. The works of art that are in the various and somewhat different displays that were held in Florence, here in New York, and then at the final destination of this exhibition, which will be in Los Angeles, are all works from a very, very narrow moment of Pontormo's production and from Florentine history, the period of 1528 to 1530. And this period is enormously important because in 1527, an epic-making event for European history took place. This was the sack of Rome. And the sack of Rome occurred because the reigning pope refused to recognize the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. He was concerned about a disproportionate imbalance of power in Europe. And this caused the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, to sweep into Italy with mercenary forces. And these dramatic events are recounted in things like Benvenuto Cellini's autobiography. But the result of this was that the Pope was driven from Rome temporarily. He had to flee to Orvieto, where he lived in exile temporarily until he reached an agreement with Charles V to recognize his authority. And this agreement had some other caveats to it. They signed the agreement by agreeing to marry their illegitimate children to each other. And Charles V also agreed to return Florence to Medici control. When Clement VII, who was the second Medici Pope, had been driven from Rome in Florence, which was still nominally a republic, although it was being ruled more or less by the Medici, the Florentines decided to take this opportunity to drive the Medici and their supporters from Florence. And they redeclared and refounded the republic based on principles that had been inspired by Savonarola at the end of the 15th century. And when Charles V and Clement VII reached their agreement about returning Florence to Medici control in Florence, they realized that they would shortly be surrounded by imperial armies and that a siege would be laid to the city. And this, too, is extremely important for understanding the history of these works. But it is part of what you see when you see these portraits together with this painting. These portraits were also executed at this time, and they are remarkable documents of dramatic changes in taste and in fashions in Florence. Young men, for the first time in 1529, cut their hair short in Florence. They had always worn their hair long to the shoulder. This was something much commented on by diarists. They started wearing smart caps, and they started wearing new kinds of garments that were regulated by laws that were actually promoted by the government itself. The padded doublets that you see these two gentlemen wearing there, which are out of a specific kind of satin, and the felt hose that they're wearing as well, all conform to specific directives that were given to the young men who wanted to be volunteers for the first time in a Florentine volunteer militia. We'll come back to them as well. And we'll discover that the amazing discoveries that were made about Pontormo's technique for the execution of the Visitation may also inform and change our ideas about how he might have executed these portraits as well. I should say that the portrait on the right, and we'll say more about this towards the end of the talk, is a very recent addition to the corpus of Pontormo. It was only rediscovered in 2008, and this is the very first time that it has traveled abroad. It's the first time that it's being seen in America. It had been lost to history for almost 200 years, so it's a remarkable opportunity, together with the Visitation at the Morgan Library. Giorgio Vasari should be familiar to many of you. Of course, Vasari is a remarkable source for the history of medieval and Renaissance painting in Italy. But he's a particularly important source for the artists that he knew personally. And he knew Pontormo personally. They had both come out of the workshop of Andrea del Sarto, but they were also rivals. And Vasari did not include a life of Pontormo in the first edition of his Lives, which was published in 1550, because he had consciously excluded living artists from the first edition of the Lives, with the one exception of Michelangelo, who was being constructed as the ultimate culmination of artistic achievement in his day. And the 1550 edition of the Lives was presented to Michelangelo as a birthday gift for his 75th birthday. When Vasari prepared the second edition of the Lives, which was published shortly after Michelangelo's death, he did add lives for some of his living contemporaries, particularly the members of the Academy that he had founded, and also some of the artists who had died in the interim, including Pontormo. And Pontormo's life is, as Vasari tells us, based on information that was provided directly to Vasari by Pontormo's own student, Bronzino, and Bronzino's own student, Allori. And for this reason, it was taken largely by scholars to be dispassionate, objective, and reliable. But studies in the last, I would say particularly last 15 to 20 years, have changed dramatically our understanding of what Vasari was doing in his life of Pontormo. It is not really a reliable or dispassionate source, and Vasari's rivalry with Pontormo continued even after Pontormo died in 1557. And the biography is constructed in many ways to attempt to diminish Pontormo's stature and to ensure that in Vasari's own day that he would be recognized as the most important painter in Florence, a title that had belonged to Pontormo before he died. In the 1568 edition of the Lives, not only were new lives added, like the life of Pontormo, but also portraits, which was something that Vasari had wanted to include with his biographies in the first edition of the Lives, but didn't have time to incorporate in 1550. And we see Pontormo in a portrait that has also conditioned our understanding of who he is. In the early 20th century, a remarkable document was rediscovered, something that was sort of misnamed Pontormo's Diary in the National Library in Florence. This is not really a diary. It's a kind of account book, a sort of memoir that's a typical document of Florentine workshops of the 15th and 16th centuries. But together with the portrait of Pontormo and some of the strange things that were attributed to Pontormo by Vasari in his biography, in the world changed by Freud's studies, Pontormo was conceived as a prototype for the Freudian neurotic. And this has conditioned enormously our understanding of Pontormo and his works by scholars in the 20th century. And we're only sort of unraveling this now. We might wish to compare what Pontormo actually looked like just before the period in which he executed the paintings that we're going to be talking about today, This stupendous self-portrait drawing, which is a very rare treasure of the Uffizi's collections, is also on display at the Morgan Library. It was not on display in Florence, for any of you who saw the exhibition in its first seat. We've saved it so that it could be seen here in the 2 US venues. This drawing was made by Pontormo as a study in order to be able to correct and add a figure to the composition for his remarkable Capponi Chapel altarpiece. You can see in the detail how he used this. The drawing was not used directly to introduce the figure into the painting. We should maybe make a distinction between the drawing being a self-portrait and the painted figure, which has been somewhat aged in order to make him appropriate for the subject that he was probably trying to make, which was either Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea. And we may have something more to say about the Capponi Chapel altarpiece too in just a moment. So the Visitation. The Visitation is thus a work that has often been thought of as being shrouded in mystery. It was not mentioned in Vasari's life, so Vasari gives us this very detailed account of Pontormo's works, and it is the major source of our understanding of what his oeuvre was, but this work was not mentioned. And this led to scholars hypothesizing all sorts of things about this painting. Perhaps that Vasari knew it, but that he had suppressed mention of it because it contained secret messages for a Republican patron that were no longer politic in the Florence of Cosimo I de' Medici. And we're going to see that that is absolutely not a sustainable theory. In addition, the work itself contains figures that seem to be very mysterious, and part of the magic and power of Pontormo's composition is not only provided by the extraordinary holy figures in the foreground, the Virgin Mary and Saint Elizabeth, but by the women who look directly out behind them. And these figures are not mentioned in the only biblical source for the subject of the Visitation, which is the Gospel of St. Luke. So they are additions, apocryphal additions to the biblical subject. They had sometimes been thought of as being perhaps wingless angels, or perhaps the holy figures themselves rotated 90 degrees and looking out at us. But I think we can be pretty certain that that's not what Pontormo intended either. Had he wished us to understand those figures as being the same as the ones who are greeting each other, perpendicular to the plane of the picture, he would have attired them in the same colors. And in fact, he's sort of inverted the colors that are being worn by the holy figures and the women who are standing behind them. In fact, these women turn out to be not so unusual at all. They are part of the worldview of people in 15th and 16th century Florence. No Florentine of the 15th or 16th century could imagine a respectable woman leaving her home unaccompanied by attendants. And as one looks back into the visual tradition of visitations, one discovers that this was actually something introduced very, very early on in Florentine art. We could look, for example, at this paradigmatic example from the mosaics in the vault of the baptistry, and we discover that the greeting figures of the Virgin Mary and Saint Elizabeth are accompanied by attendants. And I'll come back to this mosaic because it's really quite an extraordinary model. I think it's quite an explicit model for what Pontormo was doing, one of the most important models for what he was doing in the Visitation itself. We could look at another touchstone for the history of Florentine painting, a work that is not in Florence but in Padua, Giotto's famous masterpiece, his cycle in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, in which we can see that now the two holy women are accompanied not by two but by three attendant women as they exchange their greeting. And this painting seems to have been a major inspiration for another Florentine painter closer to Pontormo's day, Mariotto Albertinelli, in his stupendous monumental Visitation in the Uffizi galleries, in terms of the color of the costume and the particular pose of St. Elizabeth as she leans before the Virgin Mary. And if this was indeed an explicit model for Albertinelli, this would be particularly interesting because it would mean that Albertinelli was looking at something from 200 years before his own day. And it happens that Albertinelli was also a master of Pontormo. If Pontormo was in fact looking at the mosaics in the baptistry, this may have come from something that he had learned in the workshop of Albertinelli to look back at these models from the Middle Ages, which we were always taught were rejected soundly by the masters of the Renaissance, but in fact we discover more and more are very much part of their worldview and the visual culture that they are trying to assimilate and respond to. Pontormo certainly knew Albertinelli's Visitation, and you can see that it partly inspired an earlier Visitation by Pontormo, his stupendous fresco in the Chiostrino dei Voti in Santissima Annunziata in Florence. And here we can see many attendants and other random figures added to the composition to enliven it, and also to increase the sense of deeply receding three-dimensional space and a pyramidal composition, hallmarks of what we think of as the Italian High Renaissance. But I would also point out something else. As we start to look at this Florentine tradition of the Visitation, we start to notice that there are really kind of two strains in the Visitation. This strain, represented by what we saw in the Scrovegni Chapel, in Albertinelli's painting on the right, and in Pontormo's fresco on the left, we can see that the Virgin Mary is shown as having a higher status because St. Elizabeth kneels, bows, inclines, or in some way lowers herself before the Virgin, giving her greater prominence. And this is different from what we see in the Visitation. In the Visitation, St. Elizabeth stands erect and is almost at the same height as the Virgin Mary. There are other ways in which the Virgin is picked out as special in this painting, but they have a much more comparable status. And I will argue, that these belong to two different contexts of which Florentine artists were conscious. That is, Pontormo's painting on the left comes from a Marian shrine, and in the context of churches devoted to St. Mary, it would have been logical to show give greater status to the Virgin Mary in these paintings. Whereas in the tradition that comes from the baptistry, which is a church dedicated to St. John the Baptist, greater reverence is being shown than normally in this tradition to the mother of the Baptist. And this may be in part a clue to the still unknown original destination for Pontormo's Visitation. I would argue that the Visitation was probably intended for a church in Florence, that its original destination was not the church in Carmignano. It has a sort of long and winding story for how it arrived there, but that this is one of the clues to confirm this idea, which I did not invent. Other scholars have suggested this before, the greater likelihood that this painting was made with a Florentine destination in mind. It would have been really inconceivable to be planning and executing a painting of this scale that would have needed to have been put on an ox cart and brought out to Carmignano during the period of the siege when Florence was completely isolated, and in fact, food and supplies were not arriving in the city. Some 36,000 people died, primarily of starvation at this time. This was not, the baptistry mosaic is not the only source, of course, for Pontormo's painting. It has long been recognized that Pontormo's painting owes an important debt to Durer's remarkable engraving on the right. This is the first signed and dated print by Durer to include his famous monogram, and it includes a date in the sphere above the four women's head. However, I warmly embrace the idea of my own mentor, John Sherman, that this was not a direct source for the Visitation as conceived by Pontormo. If you look carefully, you can see that the arrangement of those four women does not really correspond to the compositional idea of the painting. It seems to inform some idea of the volumes and physical presence of female anatomy in the painting. Something perhaps about the hair, the movement, the light movement of feet, but nothing really literally being taken from Durers Engraving and incorporated by Pontormo. And I would argue, as Sherman did, that a much closer source for Pontormo's compositional idea came from frequent and common Roman sarcophagus reliefs, like the one you see on the left. This is a fragment, a beautiful fragment in the British Museum, in which, among other scenes on these sarcophagi, marital scenes were shown in which the husband and wife exchanged a greeting, sealing the marriage, and they were accompanied by witnesses who sometimes looked directly out of the relief plane. And you can see how very similar this is to the idea of Pontormo's painting, revised through the filter of Durer's idea of female anatomy, and creating a remarkable synthesis, a new idea that has important sources in local tradition, in antiquity, and in recent northern prints. These are all the things that are hallmarks of Florentine art of this period. But Pontormo does something really quite remarkable with these sources and creates something unique of his own. Pontormo famously was deeply interested in northern prints, so much so that Vasari made a particular point of criticizing him for his overdependence on Duras prints. Now, Vasari tells us, and we know this from other sources, that it is true, that at the end of the second decade of the 16th century, a particularly large number of Duras prints arrived in Florence, causing a sensation among Florentine artists. And this is not what Vasari criticized about Pontormo. He said it wasn't really problematic that he adopted compositional ideas from the German artist, but that he adopted his German style, abandoning his sweeter Italian style that he had had prior to his encounter with Durer's art. Now, what makes Vasari's accusation so damning is that there is a nugget of truth in this. Immediately following the arrival of these prints in Florence at the end of the second decade, plague broke out in Florence in 1522. These prints are arriving around 1517 to 1519. 1522, plague breaks out in Florence, and Pontormo runs away with his beloved student Bronzino, and they take refuge in the charter house south of Florence, the Certosa. Here, Pontormo was commissioned to execute a passion cycle by the Carthusian monks, and you can see, although these frescoes are very damaged, how much they are deeply indebted to Durer's compositional ideas, to very specific motifs that are lifted from them. But I would argue that this was a very logical thing to do. These prints had just arrived in Italy. They were completely novel, something that nobody had ever seen before. And here was Pontormo out at the Certosa during a period in which he was completely cut off from the city because plague had broken out. So he couldn't go into the city and acquire materials like paper, and he would have had very little access to life models, which is the very heart of Pontormo's practice. Those 400 sheets are almost exclusively composed of studies of anatomical studies and figure studies. So in order to be able to make a complex compositional idea like the one that you see in the fresco on the right, he would have needed to have made many figure studies, and the only people that he could really study from while he was locked away at the Certosa were himself, Bronzino, or the Carthusian monks themselves. In fact, at the same time, he also made a painting that's in the Uffizi. You can see how much it is indebted, once again, to the small passion cycle by Durer. And what has Pontormo primarily added to this composition? Portraits of Carthusian monks. He did, in fact, make drawings of Carthusian monks. At this time, this is a very famous sheet from the British Museum. And it is particularly remarkable because this is the recto of the sheet. On the back of the sheet, we do find that Pontormo was also making drawings from himself. He stripped off his clothes, he stood in front of a mirror, and he made this remarkable drawing of himself in his underwear because he was desperate for sources to be able to make anatomical studies at this time, and he doesn't have them available to him. So it seems to me completely logical that during this very brief moment of his career, he relies so heavily on these prints by Durer. Immediately following the end of the plague in Florence, and while he was still finishing the frescoes up at the Certosa, Pontormo got one of his most important commissions, the commissions for the decoration of the Capponi Chapel. He returns to Florence, he has open access to paper and to life models, and he stops using Durer's prints in a way that we might define as slavish. He uses them exactly as we've seen him using the print here. He takes suggestions from them, he has memories of them, but he is not using these prints in a literal way. Okay, the Visitation, as we said, is now currently in New York, normally housed in the parish church of San Michele Arcangelo in Carmignano, but we don't really know how it arrived there or where it was originally intended to go. Part of our problem in this is, of course, that it was not mentioned by Vasari, but I would argue that this is part of the reason why Vasari doesn't know this, is part of its probable history of its intended location. If we imagine that Pontormo executed this work for a Florentine church, what might have happened to its intended destination between when it was commissioned and when it was finished? And I would argue that something very like what happened to Pontormo's stupendous St. Anne altarpiece in the Louvre probably happened to the Carmignano Visitation. The painting on the right was commissioned from Pontormo by the Republican government of Florence. Pontormo began painting the work in 1528. It's extremely well documented. But before he finished executing the painting, the church was razed to the ground. And why was this? In 1528, after the Republic was declared, as I said, in 1529, they realized that the city is going to be besieged by imperial forces. And in preparation for the arrival and as part of their defense, they order a scorched earth policy around the city. Every building within 1 Roman mile of the city walls was to be razed to the ground. This included villas and farms, but it also included great monastic complexes, churches, and tabernacles as well. And in fact, the church for which this was destined was ripped to the ground. The nuns of that convent were only reassigned after the fall of the Republic during the Medici regime to a new convent dedicated to their protectress, who was Saint Anne, and the altarpiece did ultimately obtain its original intended function, which was to be the high altar of their church, although not the church that Pontormo would have gone to, looked at, studied, and examined for the lighting conditions and everything else that conditioned his compositional ideas for the painting that you see on the right. The painting that you see on the right was commissioned by the Republican government of Florence. It contains in the roundel under the feet of the Virgin Mary and Saint Anne a procession of members of the Florentine government heading out on their annual procession to the convent church of Saint Anne. This was a special feast day for Florence because Saint Anne was the protectress of the Republic. It was on her feast day that the tyrant Gualtier de Brienne, the Duke of Athens, was expelled in the mid-14th century from Florence. Now, in 1528, to commission a new high altar for a church dedicated to Saint Anne that was connected to the Republic in this way was about invoking the protection of Saint Anne once again against tyrants. And who would those tyrants have been? The Medici. This work was not too dangerous for Vasari to describe. It is described by Vasari because he knew it. And I would argue that, therefore, the reason that Vasari does not describe the Visitation is not that he was suppressing it, not to, in some way, bother the Duke with references to a difficult Republican work. This was an explicitly Republican work on the right, and he had no qualms about describing it. This is confirmation for me that Vasari simply did not know this work. And why did this happen? Because unlike the Saint Anne altarpiece, which ultimately ended up on an altar of a church in Florence that Vasari could go and see, this work ultimately did not end up on the altar for which it was destined, but ended up in the villa of the people for whom it was commissioned until it could find another destination. Interestingly, Pontormo must have had these ideas very much on his mind. And as I say, he must have gone frequently out to look at the Church of St. Anne. The Church of St. Anne was outside of Porta San Frediano in Florence, which you can see accurately depicted in this famous 15th century painting by Filippino Lippi. You can see the church and its facade directly behind the city gate, which would be ripped down in 1529. Now, interestingly, that means that Pontormo would also have walked by the palace that you can see in the detail. And you will notice that Pontormo actually reused that palace in the left side of the Visitation, reversed. And interestingly, it's probably not the palace itself that inspired Pontormo to include this compositional idea, but it was actually an homage to the earlier painter. And how can I be certain of that? Among the remarkable details that emerged during the recent conservation of the painting, things that had been painted out clumsily in previous restorations included a woman at the window hanging out with a veil over her head. And you'll see that there's one in Filippino Lippi's painting on the right. Tonight, De Nerli, who was the patron of this, is shown saying goodbye to his wife and getting ready to mount on a horse as he goes off on an important journey. The horse also sort of appears here, replaced by a donkey whose head is peeking around the corner of the palace. And these things were all lost. They have only been returned to us since 2014 with the completion of the restoration. They are things that you can see remarkably well in the installation here in New York. This whole idea about the ripping down of churches, the destruction of artworks and works of architecture and tabernacles, all of these buildings were being ripped down to ensure that the imperial forces would not use them in order to make sallies or forays against the city or use them for taking pot shots and to exploit them. A remarkable episode, though, in the destruction of these is recounted. The nephew of Niccolò Caponi, who was the first gonfaloniere of the New Republic, was given the responsibility of going around and overseeing the destruction of these tabernacles. And when he got to a tabernacle painted by Andrea del Sarto next to the Porta San Gallo in Florence, he was so struck by the beauty of Andrea's painting that they decided to exempt that tabernacle from destruction. Now, unfortunately, that tabernacle no longer survives because the painting by the 19th century was in such a destroyed state that the tabernacle was eventually ripped down. But it did survive throughout the siege of Florence and the 16th century. And we know what its composition looked like because it was so famous that it was copied by many 16th century Florentine painters. The painting that you see on the right is one of those copies, probably one of the most accurate and reliable of them. It's obviously not as good as Andrea's painting, but it gives you some idea of what the composition looked like. And this too must have been very much on Pontormo's mind when he executed this painting, because you can see that the other major building behind these women is the same tower-like form with wooden beams projecting out of it that Andrea used as a foil for the composition of the Holy Family in his painting. This was an homage by Pontormo to his master Andrea del Sarto, but it also would have been a way of incorporating something that had become very topical. It had been so admired by the Republicans that they had decided not to destroy the original of that. And this could be a way in which Pontormo was also including a detail that would have been particularly prized at this moment of fervent political discourse. Pontormo, during these years, was obviously already a famous painter. But he was not the most famous painter in Florence, or the one that was recognized by contemporaries to be the most important. It would have been Andrea del Sarto. Sarto took an active role in the defense of Florence during the siege. He enrolled in the militia. He managed to survive being in the militia and the starvation rampant in the city of Florence, only to be taken by the plague 3 months after the siege ended, leaving the field open. And it was at that moment that Pontormo became recognized by contemporaries as the greatest living painter among them, chosen by Michelangelo and by the nascent court. My argument is that Pontormo's Visitation was intended for a church not unlike the church where the St. Anne altarpiece was intended to go, that was ripped down during the preparations for the siege of Florence, and then ultimately did not end up on that altar because afterwards the Republican patron of the work simply did not wish to endow an altar in Florence. We do not know who that patron was. We believe that the patron was a member of the Pinadori family because when the work is described for the first time in 1677, it was in a villa belonging to the Pinadori. Now it happens that in Pontormo's own day, he was very close to a member of the Pinadori family, who was a man named Bonaccorso Pinadori. Bonaccorso Pinadori was a speziale, and among the exotic and expensive things that speziali sold were painters' pigments. And Pontormo frequently acquired his pigments from Pinadori. Pinadori also rented his shop from the member of the Capponi family, who had been Pontormo's patron for the Capponi Chapel altarpiece and decorations. And Bonaccorso Pinadori was connected to Pontormo and to Bronzino in other ways. He and Bronzino were members of the same confraternity later. It has been suggested by Elizabeth Cropper that possibly the young man at the Met by Bronzino is the portrait that Vasari says Bronzino painted of Bonaccorso Pinadori. Although a recent article that just came out suggests another identity for this. We do not have a secure identity for the painting, but it is an interesting idea of someone to think about that might possibly look like or give us some idea of who Bonaccorso Pinadori was. Pinadori, it has been also hypothesized, if he was the original patron of this painting, may have provided himself the pigments from which the extraordinary colors that you see in Pontormo's Visitation were made. In any case, he would have been somebody who would have been extremely sensitive to those values because he was somebody who knew deeply the costs and values of those expensive materials. How did the painting end up in the church in Carmignano? This is again a kind of mysterious question. We know that a member of the Pinadori family was seeking to endow an altar dedicated to the Visitation in the church around 1538. This has led some scholars to hypothesize that it was for Pontormo's altarpiece. I'm not in agreement with that. I believe that Cinelli was correct in 1677. We have no reason to doubt him, that it was in a villa that belonged to the Pinadori. And further evidence for this may be found in the first reference to the painting in the church. The painting first shows up in the church during a pastoral visit of the Bishop of Pistoia to the area in 1720. And the painting is recorded as being in the church at that time. But interestingly, if you read on in the pastoral visit, which has not been previously done, another priest is sent off during this pastoral visit to check out the Pinadori's villa. And the priest goes to the villa and he examines their chapel, confirming that they had a chapel at their villa, which would have been an appropriate destination for the altarpiece. And he records that the villa had recently passed from the Pinadori into another family's hands. So what does this mean? It means that the Pinadori had gone into serious decline. They could no longer afford to keep their splendid villa, and they had to sell it off. And it is extremely likely that the painting was therefore only recently removed from the villa and donated to the church in preparation for the Pinadori having to sell off their villa. It may be that this was to honor a vow that they had never made good on before, to endow an altar to the Visitation in the church and to provide an altarpiece for it. In fact, mysteriously, the altar has some very strange details in it. If you look on the right and left, you can see the upper portions of the escutcheons that are on the bases of the columns. They both are abraded. The symbols of the family or the person who commissioned the altar were removed before this stonework was set up in the church. And no name was inscribed in the plaque underneath the consecrated altar, which is extremely unusual as well. There is no other altar in the church like this. And these are indications that something had gone awry in the patronage of the altar. In fact, we discovered that the altar's stonework was only paid for in 1740 by one of the priests of the church, who commissioned other things in the church that have his coats of arms on them. So he wasn't paying for these as part of his own commission. Clearly what he was trying to do was to ensure that the renovation of the church interior was completed with its final altar. And that altar, the patrons had made bad on their promise to provide it. He had their symbols removed from it in preparation for being able to perhaps find a new patron for the altar. Being a patron of the altar meant that you had to endow it and pay regularly for masses to be said at it. This is why the priest would not have wanted to take this on himself. He would have wanted to find a local patron who would have endowed the altar for its regular masses. And we find further confirmation that the Visitation was not the painting intended for this altar in the woodwork that joins the painting to the altar as we see it. The opening in the stonework of the altar was intended for a larger painting that apparently was also not provided. And they found themselves with the need of providing an appropriate image for an altar dedicated to the Visitation in what was then a Franciscan friary church. And what did they do? They took some decorative woodwork that was lying around and they hastily slapped it together. If you look carefully, you can actually see that the foliage on the upper and lower portions of the woodwork doesn't match. You might even be able to see, because the picture is quite good, that those panels are not even regularly shaped and they were all kind of hastily thrown together as a way of simply finding a method for joining a painting that was smaller to an opening that was larger. As I said, the painting was described for the first time in 1677, together with what was described as its Modelo. This drawing was sometimes thought by previous scholars not to be that Modelo, and there were good reasons for that. If you look carefully at the drawing, you can see that there are some significant differences between the drawing and the final painting. First of all, in the drawing, we can see that the Virgin Mary and St. Elizabeth are the center of the composition, whereas the entire cluster of four are the center of the painting on the right. There are differences in the positions of, say, the head of the young attendant on the left, and the Virgin's hair is carefully bound up in her turban in the drawing, which has come undone in the painting. And we could go on with all of these changes from one to the other. But with the infrared reflectogram, we've discovered something remarkable, and that is that in the underdrawing for the painting, in every place where the drawing differs from the final painting, the underdrawing on the panel corresponds to the drawing. That means that every difference was part of a process in which Pontormo continued to elaborate his composition while he was painting it. Changes to the compositional idea, either at the level of underdrawing, or even some of those changes were made after he had begun painting, and they appear now quite clearly as pentimenti in his finished painting. But what is so particularly remarkable is this missing portion of the left-hand side of the composition. And we've solved that riddle as well in the process of working on this. The young scholar to whom I assigned the entry for the catalog, together with the restorers at the Uffizi, made a remarkable discovery. And it's kind of embarrassing that none of us ever recognized this before. On the right-hand side of the drawing, you can see that there's a careful red line marking the end of the composition, which corresponds to the end of the panel on the right. On the left, we do not have that vertical line. We have a series of interrupted horizontal lines. And this is visual confirmation of what can now be confirmed. The painting was trimmed on the left-hand side. So originally, the drawing was trimmed on the left-hand side. So it originally would have looked much more like the finished painting. Furthermore, the other remarkable discovery that was made through the reflectogram, and you can see this, I think, quite clearly, in the underdrawing, Pontormo actually replicated the grid that you see over the drawing in order to be able to expand the composition from the small scale of the drawing to the large scale of the panel. This technique is called squaring in English, or quadrettatura in Italian. And what is so unusual about this is not that he used this. This was commonly used in Florentine workshops, although it is a particular hallmark of Pontormo's workshop, and occurs very frequently in his own drawings and in the drawings of Bronzino. But what is particularly remarkable here is that he did not use a cartoon. From around the middle of the 15th century, large-scale assemblies of paper were used on the same scale as panels or frescoes in order to be able to transfer complex compositional ideas from the drawing stage to the ground of the painting. And we would expect for a painting like the Visitation that Pontormo would have used a cartoon. But in fact, there is no evidence for that. The underdrawing does not show the kinds of characteristic lines that we expect to see, either through the use of pouncing or through the use of incising in the drawing. He drew freehand, and what he was using was this grid system. In fact, all of those changes, the fact that there are no developments from this stage of drawing to the stage of drawing on the panel, is further confirmation that there was no intermediary stage in which he used this squaring to expand the idea to the size of a cartoon, which was then used to transfer the idea to the painting. This has remarkable consequences for Pontormo's portraits as well. These remarkable portraits, which obviously have a strong resemblance between them, and this was recognized for quite some time, it has been hypothesized that they were made using the same cartoon. Now, this hypothesis was made at a point in history in which we did not yet know the painting. It was known, however, its compositional idea was known through a reproductive engraving that was made after it in the 18th century, when it was in a very important Florentine collection, the collection of the Giurini family. And a German scholar in 1978, studying the collection of the Giurini family, looked at this print, and he saw that it was inscribed with an attribution to Alessandro Allori, who was the pupil of Bronzino, the pupil of, so kind of the grandchild, if you will, of Pontormo, recognized that this was not a print made after a painting by Pontormo, but that by Allori, but that it must have been after a lost painting by Pontormo. Another scholar, working on Pontormo's portraits, looked further at the inscription, and he saw that there were dimensions included in ancient palms and ounces, and he converted those into modern measurements and realized that the painting was almost identical in size to the halberdier, which is Pontormo's famous portrait in the Getty's collection. And from this, the hypothesis emerged, perhaps they were made using the same cartoon. This was an entirely logical hypothesis, a very appealing one. It entered very powerfully into the literature, and it was assumed that Pontormo did this not only for these portraits, but for other things that he executed as well. With the discovery that Pontormo did not use a cartoon, however, to paint the Visitation, but that he used squaring as the method for transferring from his final drawing idea to the panel, we have to discard this idea about these portraits unless there is scientific evidence to show that he used a cartoon for their execution. I'm waiting for scientific evidence about what's underneath the halberdier. I have seen what is underneath the magnificent, recently discovered portrait of a young man in a red cap, and there is nothing that is legible to us through available scientific means. This does not mean that there is no underdrawing in the painting. There's lots of underdrawing, and there's lots of graphic techniques in the execution of the painting. Some of these are visible in the painting's current state, as you'll see in the Morgan Library. But this is an entirely logical thing that we wouldn't be able to see this through infrared reflectography, because infrared reflectography only reveals carbon-based pigments used on white grounds. And it is almost certain that the painting on the left was painted on a brown oil ground, which would not give enough contrast to modern technology to be able to show us what Pontormo drew underneath. And we would need to be able to see that to be able to determine whether that drawing was done freehand or whether he was using a cartoon. I do not want to suggest that Pontormo never used cartoons or that he never used cartoons in portraits. We do have some scientific evidence about some of Pontormo's portraits. For the lute player on the left, evidence has been found for the use of a cartoon for the execution of the head. And that evidence is particularly powerful because the cartoon was repositioned several times by Pontormo before he decided the position of the head in relation to the neck and the shoulders. And that is confirmation that he was using a partial cartoon. So he did not use a cartoon of the entire composition, solely a cartoon of the head, which facilitated his ability to move it around, find the right position. Then he transferred the features to the ground and completed the rest of the composition. Similarly, in the magnificent portrait of Alessandro de' Medici in the Philadelphia Museum, evidence has been found for the use of a cartoon only in the execution of Alessandro's hands. And you can see why. They have difficult foreshortening, which Pontormo wanted to get correct, and the hands are engaged in a very important activity. The young Duke is being shown making a drawing, probably of his beloved, but it was a complicated action, and Pontormo wanted to get it correctly. He did not use a cartoon for the execution of the head, and we also know why, because he made an oil sketch of the Duke's head, which is now in the Art Institute of Chicago. It was later somewhat altered by the addition of chainmail and armor to make it conform to later Medici portraits of Alessandro's successor, Cosimo I de' Medici. But the features are painted by Pontormo, and they were an oil sketch made in order to be able to complete the features in the final painting. So, without evidence for the use of cartoons in the portrait of the young man in a red cap and the portrait of a halberdier, I think we must wait before presuming that they were made using a cartoon. And in fact, we have powerful evidence to suggest that quite possibly they were made using that same squaring technique, because Pontormo used squaring frequently in the execution of his portrait drawings. The magnificent drawing that you see on the right is currently on display in New York. This is also an addition to our display that was not present in Florence. Unfortunately, you cannot see the back of it, which is what I'm showing you on the left. And it is here that you can see how Pontormo worked through a compositional idea, a quick sketch for the compositional idea of the figure on the right-hand side of the sheet that you see on the left, re-elaborated with some changes to that compositional idea and some lines being reinforced on the left. He then squared this idea, which he had decided was correct, in order to be able to transfer it to another sheet that we now unfortunately no longer have. At that time, he had probably expanded it to the full size of the sheet. He then flipped this sheet over, and from what he had been working on one or more other now lost sheets, he transferred to the completed compositional idea, which you see on the right. This drawing has sometimes been associated by scholars with two important paintings that Pontormo made at the time of the Siege of Florence, which Vasari identified as being painted of young Republicans, Francesco Guardi and Carlo Neroni. Our argument for this exhibition is that the halberdier is Francesco Guardi and that the recently discovered portrait is a portrait of Carlo Neroni. This is not a study for either of those portraits, but it is another study of a young man wearing the habit of a volunteer for the Florentine Militia, shown with his short hairstyle made for defensive purposes and in conformance with the new style of the day. These are all young men. Benedetto Varchi and other commentators of the time who saw these young men as they processed through the streets of Florence commented on the splendor of their costumes. They were all from noble or wealthy families. Their defensive costumes are made of expensive satins and other elaborate materials. And the splendor of their costumes and their arms was commented on, as I say, by numerous contemporaries. You can see why they would have wanted to have been commemorated in portraiture, also because they did not know what their future was going to be. This would have been a way of preserving their memory should they die defending the city. As I say, Pontormo used squaring frequently in making portrait studies. The drawing that you see on the left is the most complete portrait drawing by Pontormo in existence, and it is squared. It is sometimes associated with an extant painting, although it is not a study for that painting, unfortunately. That painting on the right, which is in Lucca, the young man in a red cloak, in a pink cloak, is slightly different. But we get the idea. Both this drawing and this painting, by the way, are also evidence for something else remarkable that had just come through Florence. Venetian painting, an exceptional portrait by Sebastiano del Piombo of Anton Francesco degli Albizzi, painted in Rome, was shipped to Florence in 1525, and Pontormo saw it. It influenced his compositional idea for the cloak worn by the figure on the right, but it is quite possible that Pontormo also at this time was dazzled by Sebastiano's effects in rendering the reflection of light off of satin, and that he began to experiment with a more open brushwork in order to be able to reproduce some of those effects in his portraits, as you can see in these fantastic effects of light reflecting off of satin. There's another important source for this, which is Andrea del Sarto himself. Andrea had spent a year as court painter to the King of France, and he had come back to Florence, one of the few people in Florence working who had knowledge of Leonardo da Vinci's late works. And Pontormo was particularly sensitive to these innovations that Andrea brought back to Florence. In sum, it's unfortunate that the drawing on the left is not a study for the painting on the right, because it would have helped to seal up this idea that squaring was used by Pontormo to execute painted portraits, but we do have evidence from another quarter, and that is Bronzino. Bronzino, who emerged from Pontormo's workshop at the end of the siege, he stayed with Pontormo throughout the siege, but immediately following the siege, he accepted a commission to go work for the Duke of Urbino at his court in Pesaro. He only stayed there for 2 years. Pontormo wanted him back as he received his first important commissions from the new Duke of Florence. And shortly after he returned to Florence, he must have executed this stupendous painting on the right that's now in the Uffizi of a lute player. And you can see in the surviving drawing in the Chatsworth collection that it is, in fact, squared. So the idea that drawing was being executed in this workshop and that squaring was being used to transfer these ideas without the use of cartoons, at least in this period, is a very powerful one. And I say at least in this period because we're in another period like the one in which Pontormo was up at the Certosa during the plague. The city is under siege. There's no food coming in. And paper, once again, would have been something that would have been in precious supply, and they would have been worried about wasting paper under those circumstances. And I imagine that he did not use a cartoon for the Visitation simply because he did not want to use that many sheets of paper in order to be able to assemble a cartoon on the scale of the painting itself. He had another technique, and he found a practical solution to it. And I think this is one of the things that also emerges from the studies that we've made for this exhibition, how practical Pontormo was and how he uses things in practical ways to respond to the exigencies of the moment. He's up at the Certosa, he doesn't have models, he starts using Duras Prints. He comes back down, he has access to models, he does something entirely different. And under these circumstances, he does have access to models, but he's probably trying to be careful about the use of paper. Just to prove that Pontormo, in fact, did not cease using cartoons during this period, we have another example, but another example that confirms the special nature of the way that Pontormo is saving paper and resources at this time. Pontormo made 2 paintings during the Siege of Florence, 2 versions of the same subject, a rare apocryphal subject of the martyrdom of Saint Acacius and the 10,000 martyrs. And he used a drawing that he had made several years earlier, almost a decade earlier, for a commission for a confraternity that was dedicated to Saint Acacius. This drawing survives, it's in Hamburg. And scientific analysis that was executed on these 2 paintings, one in the Pitti Palace and the other in the Uffizi, revealed that for the portions of these compositions that correspond to what you see in the drawing, Pontormo used the drawing as a cartoon. Now, this drawing was not a cartoon. It was a small drawing for what was to be a very large fresco. It's lying around his studio. He's never going to execute this commission any longer. It's available to him. He uses it, and he allows Bronzino to use it on the left as a cartoon. Once again, this is a time-saving and materials-saving method for working. Curiously, remarkably, what does not correspond to this drawing in these paintings was executed freehand in the drawing stage on the gesso ground. And these are remarkable discoveries made by the scientific analysis of these paintings in preparation for conservation work. This painting is very important to us because the larger version is the beginning of the paragraph in Vasari's life in which he describes subsequently the 2 portraits, the portrait of the halberdier and the portrait of the young man known as Carlo Neroni. He was the patron of the second version of Pontormo's Martyrdom of the 10,000, which scholars now believe was executed by Bronzino. And this version was almost certainly commissioned because Neroni saw in the first painting a remarkable analogy to this dramatic moment in their history. Faithful Christian soldiers martyred by imperial forces sent by an evil emperor. That subject is eliminated from this second version, but in the background you can see that Bronzino introduced landscape details that refer to the city of Florence, making the subject topical and a kind of keepsake of survival, perhaps, of this dramatic moment in time. This exhibition has been organized partly also as a way of drawing people's attention to the remarkable artistic patrimony of the city of Carmignano. I hope you'll bear with me for 3.5 minutes as I show you a video which is part of the launch of a crowdfunding campaign to save this complex. Worked during the chest, sorry.
La nostra storia inizia nel 1211, quando San Francesco venne nelle nostre campagne, secondo la tradizione, e qui costruì un primo nucleo di seguaci e favorì la costruzione di un primo convento, che poi dopo è diventato la pieve dei Santi Michele e Francesco a Carmignano. La pieve ha un grande valore per la comunità e è di per sé anche uno scrigno d'arte, infatti conserva al suo interno la Visitazione di Jacopo Carrucci, detto il Pontormo, che è qua da diversi secoli. L'opera venne commissionata dalla nobile famiglia dei Pinadori, che erano dei mercanti di colori, che erano amici dei Medici e avevano proprietà qua a Carmignano.
I remember my own first encounter with the painting when I was an undergraduate student studying in Italy. I was brought by a teacher to Carmignano, and the parish priest opened up the locked church and allowed us to come inside. And I remember the magic of discovering a work as extraordinary as Pontormo's Visitation in such an out-of-the-way setting.
I have now had the good fortune to work with this painting as co-curator of an international exhibition in Florence, New York, and Los Angeles. Pontormo's Visitation is traveling with an important message of preservation.
Part of the magic of encountering art in Italy is the joy of discovering a work like the Visitation in a place that we might not otherwise have visited. But the problem, of course, with maintaining artistic patrimony in such contexts is ensuring its protection and safety. And often the buildings that house these works are as old as the works themselves. They require enormous attention and care in order to keep them sound, healthy, and safe environments in which to preserve these works of art.
Il progetto di restauro parte da un primo intervento indispensabile, il recupero del tetto. Vedete in che situazioni siamo. Dopodiché bisogna passare al ripristino delle murature. È necessario rendere di nuovo agibili le stanze del vecchio convento, compreso il refettorio e il chiostro, così come dobbiamo salvare dall'incuria l'oratorio della Compagnia di San Luca con i suoi affreschi e le decorazioni ottocentesche. Questi spazi diventeranno non solo nuovamente il fulcro della vita sociale della nostra comunità, ma si apriranno alle visite da parte di amanti dell'arte di tutto il mondo. Noi vorremmo creare il nuovo Museo della Visitazione, un luogo per conservare e comunicare il capolavoro del Pontormo in quella che da sempre è la sua casa. Ecco, oggi abbiamo l'occasione di salvare dal degrado del tempo l'intero complesso della pieve, a partire qua dal chiostro, dalla chiesa, da tutta l'area conventuale e dal suo nucleo originario, che è la cappella di San Luca. Per questo chiediamo il vostro contributo, perché vogliamo proteggere questo luogo, vogliamo restituirlo alla sua antica bellezza, vogliamo dare alla Visitazione del Pontormo la cornice che si merita.
Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions. Would you wait for the microphone so that we'll all be able to hear you?
How did all of those Duras prints get to Rome? And did Pontormo use a camera obscura to create the grid?
There was enormous traffic between the north and the south of works on paper. Of course, the printing press and movable type were invented in the mid-15th century by Gutenberg in Germany, but presses followed rapidly in Italy. However, there was an enormous interest in what northern printmakers were doing already from the 15th century. In fact, a work that I didn't talk about here, but that was displayed in Florence and will be seen again in Los Angeles, shows Bronzino cribbing something from a print by Schongauer, who was the principal printmaker before Dürer. So there was a long history of interest already from the 15th century in prints that came from the north, and they were highly movable things, and they were reproducible. They were made in series. So prints came into Italy from the 15th century quite regularly. I don't know about Pontormo using a camera obscura. I'm a little skeptical about the hypothesis that the camera obscura was used to the extent that some scholars have hypothesized. It doesn't seem likely to me. We saw, for example, in the, let's see if I could bring this up. In Pontormo's earlier career, he was interested in the creation of remarkable architectural settings that used the one-point perspective system to create a believable illusion of three-dimensional recession in space. In the Visitation, you can see that he's no longer interested in that. In fact, he's moving towards an art in which the human figure is the sole means of communication, deeply influenced by the innovations of Michelangelo, who, in fact, immediately following the siege, will select Pontormo as the painter to execute works from his own cartoons. And this the painting on the right does not show the kinds of 15th century preoccupations with deeply believable three-dimensional receding space. It shows a kind of rapidly receding perspective, and the figures are thrust towards the foreground to give them greater grandeur. But again, would not have required the kind of accuracy that a camera obscura would have permitted to the painter. Thanks. Yes, there's another question. Oh.
Bruce, I was very much struck by the bright colors, the rainbow palette that he used, and I associated this with Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel frescoes when they were cleaned, how bright and brilliant they were, and the rainbow effect of the. Could you say something about that? Do you think he might have been influenced, or the Florentines might have been influenced by the colors of the Sistine Chapel frescoes when they were brand new?
No doubt. Although we don't really know whether Pontormo had traveled to Rome by this date. We have later evidence of him traveling to Rome. It has been hypothesized by significant scholars of Pontormo that he had traveled sometime before this work. However, he wouldn't have needed to have traveled to see the Sistine Chapel to have seen the chromatic context from which Michelangelo's colorism in the chapel came. Michelangelo's only completed easel painting is the Doni Tondo in the Uffizi, and it shows a very similar, very bright chromatic range. I think what's really remarkable is that Pontormo responds to different situations with different techniques and different chromatism. The palette of the Capponi Chapel altarpiece is also extraordinarily bright, but it's very different from the saturated hues of the Visitation. And that's also because of a recent scientific discovery. We've discovered something really remarkable. Pontormo executed this altarpiece, which is even larger than the Visitation, in tempera and not in oil. And this once again points to Pontormo being somebody with very creative responses to the uses of materials, to the desire to respond to specific context with specific solutions. This was a context in which he was executing an extraordinary fresco cycle as well. And he chose a technique that in theory was no longer popular in order to be able to produce a chromatism that accorded well with the frescoes that would make a kind of overall look to the entire chapel's decorations. If you have an opportunity to travel to Florence, go and see the entire chapel since it's been restored, because the fresco of the Annunciation that still survives from that fresco cycle is remarkable in its chromatism and how it compares to this altarpiece. What I think is amazing is that in the Visitation, he doesn't use that palette, he uses something else. So this must have been a response to a specific context for which he was making this work. And again, if we are correct in assuming that Bonaccorso Pinadori was the patron, he was making it for someone who sold pigments and would therefore have had a particular sensitivity to dramatic chromatic range and the costs of those materials as well, what had gone into making a costly and valuable altarpiece.
Yeah, like I noticed that the shadows are the darkest value of the same color. There's no black or brown to shade. He uses the deepest value of the color to do his modeling, which is quite interesting.
Well, color modeling has a long and important Florentine tradition. It goes well back into the 15th century. Yes, there was a question over here.
I probably missed it, but
Could you wait 1 second? Here we go. Thanks.
the drawing that was in the first slide, where does that live? You know,
This drawing?
That one.
That is also from the Uffizzi's collection.
Oh, okay.
Yes. The Uffizi owns more than half of the surviving known corpus of Pontormo's drawings. It's especially rich and important holding of his drawings. And all of the drawings that we have studied for this project belong to the Uffizzi's collection.
Hi. Did I get it correct that a point of difference for this painting is that the women are appearing without companions?
No, the women here are with companions.
Those would be their companions. Okay. That's just clarifying.
In Albertinelli's altarpiece, he was one of Pontormo's masters. Pontormo's first apprenticeship was served in the workshop of Leonardo da Vinci, probably for less than a year. He passed through Albertinelli's workshop before arriving in Andrea del Sarto's, where he may have arrived as an already emancipated master and a collaborator. He didn't stay very long in Andrea's workshop. He was famously driven from it, although I don't believe that they remained in opposition to each other, because they collaborated on numerous projects afterwards. Yeah.
Bruce, you were so brilliant on the context of the 1520s. Really loved that.
Thank you.
I wonder whether you'd say a word about the 1740 moment. And we're talking now about post-Medici in Italy, early Enlightenment. What's Pontormo standing, right, 2 centuries after Vasari? What does he mean at the moment of the altar?
That's an excellent question. I don't think we should assume that he was discarded or that they were not interested in him. The late Medici, in particular, collected an enormous number of 16th century paintings. Many paintings that we see in the Uffizi or in the Pitti Palace today that we assume had always been in the Uffizi's collection actually turn out to have been bought by members of the family in the 17th and the 18th century. So there was a continued interest. Perhaps there was no member of that generation of artists who commanded that interest in such a constant way as Andrea del Sarto. But Pontormo would have maintained an extraordinarily high status for the prestige that had been given to him by Vasari, in spite of the kind of backhanded compliments he gives him. But Vasari himself couldn't construct the world of artists that he wanted to without Pontormo. Pontormo was so important to Vasari that he had his body moved into the chapel that he created for as the seat of the Florentine Academy, which is acknowledgement that Pontormo was a cornerstone, a founder. His body had to be in the crypt underneath the chapel. And this ensured a certain status for him. And I think the other thing about him was that the fact that he had been selected by Michelangelo immediately following the siege to execute works was confirmation of Michelangelo's extraordinary respect for Pontormo's art. And that, too, would have maintained a great interest in Pontormo's work. Now, there's no doubt that Pontormo kind of falls away at a certain point. Interestingly, I discovered a reference to this painting that had not been previously published as I was researching my essay for the catalog. The painting was described in 1833 by Repetti in his remarkable dictionary of Tuscan geography. And he refers to the painting as being as being malconcio, he says in Italian, which means that it's kind of beat up or in bad condition. But I don't think that's what he actually meant. I think what he meant was that it was darkened by years of being exposed to the fat of tallow candles and the soot of incense, and so that it was darkened by that date. But it suggests that if the painting did enter the church shortly before 1720, and then it was kind of dolled up in order to be able to fit into the altarpiece, by the time it was seen by Repetti, it would not have been a fresh work. It would have been a work that would have been used continuously in devotional practices, and it had not attracted the attention of anyone significant enough to become a draw to Carmignano as it has in the 20th century. Its real sort of history of moving people begins in the 20th century with its publication in 1906 by Count Carlo Gamba, and that begins the modern historiography of the painting. It preceded very shortly the creation of the first catalogue raisonné of Pontormo's paintings and drawings by Clapp. And it is the beginning of a very sort of fortuitous history of the painting in which it became one of the most beloved and admired masterpieces by the artist.
Never on the Grand Tour in the later 18th
no,
century.
I would
Nobody
say,
ever mentions it.
No, I mean, we have no other references to it. And as I say, even the 1833 reference was ignored up until this catalog. So it's not in the bibliography of the painting up until now. That means that basically it was assumed previously that from 1677 until 1906, no publications had ever made reference to this painting. So it was clearly off the radar screen of people on the Grand Tour. It was not a lure out to Carmignano, as it is now, and as we hope that it will continue to be for the future.
Thanks to you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Melissa.
I wondered if you could talk about this painting in and against the tradition of female portraiture at the time. A few minutes ago, you mentioned that the bodies are thrust forward, and there's such an emphasis on them with the sort of usual attributes stripped away or pushed to the side, as you pointed out when you gave us the sort of the iconography of visitations. And I just wondered if you could read this against female portraiture.
That's a fantastic question.
I don't
and of
have
course,
one in mind.
It's a fantastic question. Of course, one of the sort of surprising things about this exhibition has been the conjunction, the bringing together of portraits by Pontormo together with this very important altarpiece. We tend to think of these things typologically and separate them out, but obviously painters don't work that way. They're thinking about solutions for all kinds of things that they work on simultaneously. Pontormo is one of the great portrait painters of the 16th century Florence, and with the halberdier and the portrait of the young man in the red cap, he invented a new portrait typology that was followed for the next 100 of years in portrait painting. But he was also a remarkable painter of female portraits, and we both know that in the period immediately following this, as Pontormo emerges as a court artist, something that was very much discounted about him up until very recently, and I would say even on myself, I don't think I was really fully conscious until quite recently of how much Pontormo is really a court artist in the next phase. We tend to think of him as not being as successful at court as his own student, Bronzino, because of Bronzino's remarkable corpus of paintings, mostly portraits of the Medici family. But it was in fact Pontormo who was the first official portrait painter to the burgeoning dynasty of Medici dukes. He made that remarkable portrait of Alessandro de' Medici that we saw before, and then Alessandro was rapidly assassinated and succeeded by Cosimo I de' Medici, who, as we know, his career was very much determined by his mother. And in fact, the very first portrait that Pontormo made of the young duke was made only 6 months after he became duke, and it was made as a companion to a portrait of his mother. And I think Pontormo's sensitivity to the distinct nature of gendered anatomical features, of a way of thinking about human anatomy in volumes, and of the particular aesthetic of his women shows a particular sensitivity and kind of sort of naturalistic observation. On the other hand, we should say about almost all of Pontormo's figures of women, including some of his portraits, even of the Duke's mother, Maria Salviati, that many of them began their life as figure studies of naked young men. And because it was logical, who would be most available in the Renaissance workshop to make life studies from? It would have been the workshop assistants. He didn't have to pay them, and he could either draw them nude, or he could ask them to don the garments of the subjects that he was studying to make portraits. And it has been hypothesized, for example, that in the case of one of the portraits of Maria Salviati, that a study, particularly of the costume, was made with her costume being donned by one of the workshop assistants. And a figure like this one, with its kind of extraordinary androgyny, may well have undergone this kind of transformation in Pontormo's creative process, starting as a study of a young man. Workshop assistants would have been around 13, 14, 15 years old, and eventually evolving and being rendered feminine through the change in the shape and nature of certain features. In a completely different way, the older women on the right, I think, cannot have begun their lives and undergone a process of this sort. They so powerfully suggest portraiture. And they must have been born of careful observation of older women that Pontormo knew. And so very, very close to the spirit of portrait painting. And many people have wanted to see portraits in particularly the figure of the older attendant who looks out at us. That's a very provocative idea. I don't think it should be excluded. If we knew more about the commission and its original destination, we might know more about whether it is possible that one or more of those figures was intended as an homage to an actual person. I don't know if I really answered your question, but it was a great one, and I'll continue to think about it. Thank you. Yes, I think there's one more question.
Comment on the psychology that's going on between these figures, because the two attendants seem very blank. It's almost like a foil for the way Mary and Elizabeth are looking at each other. It's like,
What I argue in my essay for the catalog is that these are part of a very specific project on the part of the painter to engage the spectator. And these figures who look directly out at us are meant to address us on the other side of the picture plane as worshipers at the altar, to draw us into devotional practices that were particularly encouraged first by the Franciscans, later by the Dominicans, and by other orders, but has its origins in the Franciscan spiritual revolution of the 13th century and the new kind of narrative art that was sponsored by them. I hypothesize, in fact, that this work was intended for a Franciscan church, an observant Franciscan church outside the walls of the city of Florence that still survives. It wasn't razed to the ground, but underwent extensive damage during the siege of Florence. And that a church, either that church or one very much like it, may have been the original intended destination of this. So these figures have this expression because they are meant to address us as members of the public. Many devotional practices encouraged by Franciscan and Dominican preachers from the 13th century on encouraged spectators to look at devotional works and to transpose onto those figures the features of people that they knew well. Imagine that the Virgin Mary is like your own mother, or that the Magdalene is like your sister. And a certain kind of idealization in these sort of religious figures may have been intended to facilitate those kinds of devotional practices. This is something that has been hypothesized, although it is very controversial, about the works of a devotional painter like Perugino. And I only see the young attendant on the left as having this kind of idealization. The older attendant on the right, and the reason that they have different ages is that this too conforms to contemporary practice. A woman would have been assigned an attendant, a woman of a patrician family would have been assigned an attendant at the moment of her marriage. That attendant would have had a similar age to her, and they would have grown old together. So the young Virgin Mary has a young attendant. The older saint, her older cousin, has an older attendant. Thanks.
Thank you. I've just noticed a slight detail in the portrait of the two young men you show, and in this portrait, in the hands, the position of the hands, there are two fingers, the middle finger and the fingers. They remind me a lot of El Greco. Like you could see the two young men with the two fingers united, and also in the Virgin with the two fingers.
These, I think these are sort of very broad, general things in the society of the time. El Greco, of course, was also a painter who was trained in Italy in the 16th century, but he comes from a different school. He comes from the north, from Venice. But these ideas about these positions of the hands, they conform to sort of standard ideas about elegance. And these are ways of communicating, both in the case of the portraits and in the case of the magnificent gesture of the Virgin Mary as she touches the shoulder of Saint Elizabeth, a particular kind of aristocratic elegance that comes through these completely unnatural hand gestures. But they must have been studied with great care from life. That is, Pontormo would have looked at his own hand or the hands of other members of his workshop posed in these not very comfortable positions. If you stand for a while doing this, you'll recognize how unnatural it is in order to be able to reproduce those effects in the paintings themselves. Yes, I think this is the last question. Thank you.
Well, this is an appropriate last question because I wanted to get back to the work on the church. Is the Visitation traveling right now in order to get it out of the church so they can do work on the roof? And tell us about the timeline and the extent of the work that's going on.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful question to close with. No, the painting was not removed from the church because the church itself was in danger of collapse. The church, in fact, was the best preserved part of the complex. It's everything else around the church that is in that horrific state of preservation that you saw in the video. The church was originally a Franciscan friary up until the second half of the 18th century. Up until the second half of the 18th century, when it was deconsecrated under the Leopoldan reforms during the after the Medici dynasty had gone out, and it was made into the parish church of San Michele. There had been two previous locations for the parish church before it was united with what had been the church of St. Francis, which according to legend was actually founded on land donated by St. Francis himself. So the church was in very, very good state of preservation when the painting was removed to begin its journey as part of this project. Unfortunately, while the painting was already out of the church, a terrible accident happened and a garbage truck backed into the loggia of the church, damaging an entire bay of the loggia and opening up a hole in the roof of the church itself. Now, that is not what the crowdfunding campaign is really about. That will obviously be taken care of by the their insurance. But as news reporters noted at the time, it was very fortunate that the painting was safely outside of the church when this happened. What we hope is that by the time the painting returns to the church, that the entire complex is in a healthy enough state that it can properly preserve and be properly climatized in order to be able to preserve the painting in ideal conditions so that it will remain for another 500 years in the splendid condition that we see it today. Thank you.